I want to get to the vexed question of our relationship with Iran now. There is growing evidence, apparently, that Iran's elite forces may actually be helping President Bashar al-Assad in Syria in his ongoing and violent crackdown on the pro-democracy protesters there. We're joined by Colonel Cedric Leighton, who's U.S. Air Force, retired, and president of Cedric Leighton Associates now, joining us from our D.C. bureau. Colonel, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's good to be with you.
How strong is this evidence that Iran is actually aiding President Assad in terms of actually sending forces to participate in the crackdown?
It's pretty strong. The Iranians and the Syrians have had quite a relationship over the years. I've noticed it personally all the way back to the 80s, which would take it back to the regime of Hafez al-Assad and the father of Bashir Assad. And, you know, in this particular situation with Iran and Syria working together to quell each other's domestic disturbances, there was evidence that the Syrians and Hezbollah helped the Iranians crush the 2009 demonstrations, and they're basically returning the favor. And it seems as if there are Iranian operatives present. There is a Quds base, which is in the area near Latakia, Syria, and on the coast there. And there are some other bases that the Iranians are using. And they're not only funneling their advice, but they're providing training, they're providing intelligence, and they're providing other services to the Syrian army and the Syrian police in an effort to quell these demonstrations.
Would say, well, we may be trying to influence what happens in Syria, but so are you, America, and the rest of the West. You're trying to do the same, but on the flip side of it. So isn't this fair game for everybody?
Well, of course they would say that, because what the Iranians are trying to do is they're trying to play the great power game in, you know, in the Middle East at least, and they're trying to play it with us. And they think they have a big advantage, and they are going to take that advantage home, because what has happened is, of course, we have withdrawn from Iraq, and in 2 years' time we're about to withdraw from Afghanistan. So what you're looking at is basically what the Iranians would call open space. So yes, they would come back and they would say, hey, you're playing this game, we can play this game too, and oh, by the way, we're going to make it dangerous for you. And that is exactly how the Iranians see it. Of course, from our point of view, what we're looking at is we're trying to facilitate a more democratic regime in Syria and a more democratic regime in Iran. So we believe that we have the more righteous cause, if you will, in these situations, and that is really what's happening here. We're trying to work with the opposition elements on a covert basis, but it is not panning out the way it really should.
I'll come back to other issues with Iran in a moment, Colonel, but first of all, on Syria itself, how do you see the next few months playing out there? Because it appears to me we're at pretty much a stalemate right now. There's a certain number of protesters coming out every week. They don't seem to be increasing in numbers, partly because obviously President Assad is cracking down so violently, which puts us at this stalemate. The core group of protesters coming out every week, President Assad clearly not going anywhere. So what changes the game here?
Well, I think what's going to happen is you're going to see more activity among the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood has kind of stepped back a bit. They were, of course, victimized by the Assad regime under Hafez al-Assad back in the early 1980s in Homs, where he committed that huge massacre against the civilian population and against Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers. They're going to come back, and I would bet they would come back maybe a little bit at first, but then once they get their momentum going, probably with a vengeance. And if that happens, then you can see Syria go into an all-out civil war, and that would be a very dangerous thing. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if that happens that, let's say, Bashar Assad is toppled. It does not necessarily mean that that would result in a regime that is friendly to the United States or to Western interests.
And this is, I mean, I guess what we have here is the danger that we've had in every one of these revolutionary movements, that we don't know what is going to come next. And so it's an opportunity for democracy, but it's also a great danger.
It is, that's correct. And the reason for that is, within the Syrian population, there are very few institutions of democratic governance. And that makes it really hard for a democratic, liberal standpoint with a small L to actually gain a foothold in that country. So what you'll probably see is something like what's going on in Libya right now, possibly something like what's going on in Iraq, where there are a lot of political factions vying for control. Many of them have, in our view, radical ideologies, and that's going to create a real problem in terms of, who do you believe, who do you support, how are you going to actually make the ends justify the means in terms of, working with the different areas that could potentially topple an Assad regime, and that's a very difficult dilemma for Western policymakers, for the EU, and also for the Iranians, quite frankly.
And why is it important to our viewers, as they sit here listening to you now, why is it important to them what happens in Syria?
To the Iranians, it is very important because the Syrians are their prime and really now only Arab ally. They had an ally of sorts in Muammar al-Gaddafi, and that depended on how much he wanted to tweak the Western noses, whether it was the EU or the United States. And in these particular days, what we're dealing with is a situation where the Syrians are Iran's only friend in the Arab world, and they seek to influence the Arab world. And if they lose that degree of influence, then they will be further isolated and further against the wall, and then sanctions will have an even greater effect against them. So that's the situation that the Iranians are trying to avoid right now.
All right, so sticking with the Iranians, there's been a lot of saber rattling on both sides of this ongoing problem now, with the Iranians threatening to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, the Obama administration saying that would be a grave error. How do we handle Iran going forward? The sanctions that they've put in place now seem to be biting to some extent, but is it enough?
Probably not. Sanctions have a way of working in the short term. You'll remember the oil for food situation in Iraq, and that was the UN way to handle humanitarian issues while we had sanctions in the Iraq of Saddam Hussein. In this particular situation with the Iranians, it will probably hurt the Iranian population, but it will do nothing, in my view, to actually affect their progress toward a nuclear weapon or to weaponizing what they already have. And that really is the goal, is to prevent them from projecting their power over what and above what they've already done. And it will also work toward probably making them more able and more willing to try whatever technological breakthrough they can to achieve a nuclear weapon capability.
So, but without the support of the Russians, who remain Iran's friend, at least within the UN Security Council, what more can we do? How do we apply pressure more effectively? How do we bring about any change, not just in Iran's nuclear policy, but perhaps in the regime itself?
Well, I think one way to do it is probably to provide more support to the Syrian rebels. And of course, the challenge that we talked about was working with which faction. Which faction do you support when you don't really know what each of these factions stands for? And that can be very, very difficult. But then you go to the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that is probably the way to do it. Put pressure on the Iranians in Syria. Make sure that Iranian moves in Saudi Arabia and in other parts of the Gulf are countered, and also make sure that it's very, very clear, and the administration has basically done this, very, very clear that any attempt to cut off the Straits of Hormuz in terms of shipping, that would be countered with a very quick reaction from the United States. And that would start in the general direction, but also we have to be very unequivocal in our diplomatic signals and make sure that we have military exercises with Persian Gulf nations other than Iran, that the Iranians know that there's a message out there, and that message is we will go after you if you violate the norms of international behavior. And that, I think, in the nutshell, is basically the way we want to respond to the Iranians, make sure that they understand that there is a force out there that they need to be reckoning with.
Finally, Colonel, before I let you go, there's a lot of analysts out there who believe that 2012 is the crucial year in terms of Iran and its nuclear ambitions, that they could indeed develop a functioning nuclear weapon sometime within the next 11 or 12 months. Do you agree with that scenario?
I do, and I think it may happen actually earlier than that. This may happen, the Iranian capability to weaponize a nuclear weapon may happen as early as 6 months from now. But it really depends. If we're effective, or if somebody is effective in countering the Iranian efforts, then it may take a little bit longer. But I would see an Iranian weapon being possible, a nuclear weapon being possible, anywhere from 6 months to a year from now.
Okay, Colonel Cedric Leighton, who is president of Cedric Leighton Associates and U.S. Air Force retired. Colonel, great to have your insights as always. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to be with you.
Okay, we are going to